Good morning, Year 5. It is day 22. Sorry, I just ran up the stairs. Nearly lunchtime, but I just thought I'd read before I go and eat my lunch. Okay. I thought, Cole, I think were they back at school? No, always back at home after being at Mason's house and he spilt the juice. I thought of meeting Mason's dad last night. With his smart white shirt and bright wide smile, he would have plenty of money to pay for someone to fix the boiler. He had a proper job, just like everyone else's fathers. What made it worse was that all my friends knew that my dad did nothing. When Mabel was just a few months old, our teacher in primary school sent letters home asking for parents to come in for a World of Work session. Before I was born, Dad used to work as a roadie with a rock band. He got to travel all over Europe helping to carry the band's instruments and equipment in and out of venues and set it all up. It sounded like an amazing job, and I was so pleased when Dad said he'd come and join the session. When we got to school, my teacher, Mrs. Williams, was at the door welcoming everyone. Parents, thank you so much for coming. If you can make your way to the hall, I'll bring the children in after registration. Dad gave me a pat on my head and followed the other adults. There were 5 of them, 3 dads and 2 mums. The other dads were wearing suits and one of them woman was wearing a green uniform. I thought she might have been a paramedic. After we had all said good morning, Mrs. Williams, we headed to the hall. My dad was sitting at the front with the other adults and Leighton's dad was setting up a PowerPoint presentation next to a big projector. Dad didn't have a presentation. He was just going to talk, but his job was going to be far more interesting than the others. "Dad! Dad!" called Leighton, waving madly, even though he had seen him only 10 minutes ago. I sat in the second row and beamed at my dad, who gave me a wink. "Right, everybody, this is exciting, isn't it?" said Mrs. Williams, standing at the front. "Today we have met some very special guests who are kindly going to tell us a little bit about their jobs. Now, I want you to listen carefully to what the grown-up is saying, and then we can take a few questions. So, shall we start with you, Mr. Morgan?" Leighton's dad clicked the laptop and grinned at us. On the projector behind him was an advert for a local estate agent. "Hands up if your parents own their own house," said Mr. Morgan. A sea of hands shot up. I kept mine down. We were living in my great-aunt's house, and although we paid her to live there, we didn't own it. She gave us a discount as we were family, but on the understanding that we had to pay for any repairs. "Okay, so that's most of you," he said, pacing back and forth. "That's great. So your parents would have come to someone like me to buy their house. I'm an estate agent." Mr. Morgan's presentation consisted of slides of different houses that he'd sold in the local area, including how much they cost. It was quite interesting to start with, as we got to see the insides of some cool places, but after a while we all began to fidget on the hard chairs. The only person not moving about was Leighton, who scowled at anyone who wasn't paying attention. Mrs. Williams asked us if any of us had any questions. Someone asked about the most expensive house that he had sold, and someone else asked what his favourite colour was, so Mrs. Williams said it was probably time we moved on to our next guest. Catherine Shelton's dad went next. He was a lawyer and got everyone excited as we all thought he worked with criminals and murderers, but it turned out he was mostly helping people get divorced. Then it was Pia Bowman's one, who was an optician. She showed us some of the instruments she used to do an eye examination, and Dean went to the front and tried on the big frames that they used to check what strength glasses you needed. The mum in the green uniform was after that. I was right, she was a paramedic, and she told us about how she tried to save someone's leg after they'd been in a car accident. She was just getting to a really gory bit when Mrs. Williams went a bit pale and stopped her, saying that we were running out of time and had to move to the final guest. My stomach turned over as Dad stood up and walked to the front of the class. Mrs. Williams introduced him as Mr. Miller, and he began. "We've heard about some really interesting jobs here this morning, haven't we?" he said. It was weird hearing my dad talking like a teacher. The class nodded and all said yes back at him. I couldn't wait for everyone to hear about his amazing job and all the famous bands that he'd met. "Well, I think I might have the most important job that has ever existed. Would any of you like to guess what that might be?" A few hands went up and Dad picked them out. "A policeman," said one. Dad shook his head. "A politician? A footballer?" Dad smiled and said no to each one. I felt a bit uneasy. Okay, so being a music roadie was cool, but it wasn't exactly the most important job in the world, not compared to being the Prime Minister or something. There were some really good answers there, but no, my job is even more important than all of those. I am a father. My stomach plummeted and hit the cold wooden floor of the hall. This was a disaster. I slowly sank down in my seat and folded my arms. "That's not a job," shouted Trevor O'Riordan from the back. "Oh, but it is," said Dad. "Cole's mum works full-time and she is the only other person in our house that earns the money, but I still have a great deal of responsibility as my role is to look after my son and baby daughter." I could feel my face burning. What about touring the world, the big concerts, the famous rock stars? A few people turned around and looked at me, but I kept my eyes on the floor, winning him to stop speaking. Why couldn't he be a state agent like Leighton's dad, or a paramedic, being brave and saving lives? Dad carried on talking about how looking after your children is a very important job, but by that point everyone had completely lost interest. Mrs. Williams jumped up out of her seat and asked if anyone had any questions. I held my breath and prayed that no one but would, but then a girl at the front of me put her hand up. Have you ever worked? I have, said Dad, at last. Now it would get interesting. I sat right upright and smiled at Dad. Now they got to hear all about his proper job. I worked along in the music business, and I used to tour the world alongside lots of bands. This was more like it. I looked around and saw a flicker of interest in a few people's faces. But then we realised that my low pay and being away from home so much wasn't really working. I took the decision to become a full-time dad. After all, money isn't everything. He laughed after he said that, but the hall was silent. I hunched my shoulders and stared down at my lap. Surely the time was up now. Niall raised his hand and I groaned. Are you poor? He asked, and I could see him smirking. Mrs. Williams went to say something, but Dad was already answering. I guess if you were asking if we are poor by the amount of money we have, then yes, we are poor. There was a low-level gasp across the hall. But we are rich in other ways. We get to spend a lot of time together as a family, and that is priceless. No one said anything. I felt sick. I could tell Dad was looking at me, but I avoided his eyes. Why'd I thought he was going to talk about his roadie job? Why? We gave the parents a round of applause, and after they left, we filed back to class. Someone shoved me on the shoulder. Well, that was well funny, said Leighton. Poor kid, Cole. I can't speak today. If that's your dad's job, are you his boss? Does he get benefits? My uncle used to get money for doing nothing. My mum said he was lazy, said Shannon. I wanted to cry. Everyone looked at me differently after that. From then on, I became Poor Kid Cole, a nickname that has stuck with me ever since. I was the one whose dad stayed at home and didn't work, and now it looked like Mum was out of a job too. So we're going to be fighting some prejudices, I think, in this book. Chapter 4, Marika visits the school. So the artist is coming. After Mum's bombshell about using her job, I headed off to school. I left my parents in the kitchen talking about what they were going to do next. It didn't sound like they had much of a plan. Also, I could tell by their voices that they were worrying, and that made me feel even more panicky. When I got to the playground, everyone was buzzing about their trip to Thrill Kingdom. There was no sign of Mason, so I stood behind Niall, Leighton and Dean. Hey, Poor King Cole, said Niall, turning around and slinging his arm across my shoulders. You missed such a brilliant day. Yeah, the park was empty. There were no queues at all, said Dean. We went straight on everything. Great, I muttered, looking out for Mason. The three of them carried on chatting about all the funny things that had happened, and then there was a loud clatter behind us. We turned around. It was Isla Roberts dropping her cello case. We watched as she adjusted the bag on her shoulder and then scooped up the large back case and struggled across the tarmac with it. Isla was some kind of musical genius. She had time off normal lessons so that she could do extra practice for national competitions. She was that good. There goes Mozart, said Leighton, laughing. What a loser. Leighton seemed to find nicknames hilarious. The bell rang as we trooped inside. I noticed that one of the posters that Mason and I had put on the door was hanging by a single pin. Today was the day Marika Loft, the famous artist, was coming to visit us. Mason came running into our forum room just before the end of registration. All right, he panted, his face red. His parents left for work before he woke, so every morning he had to get himself up, have breakfast, and set the house security system before going to school. He had a lot of late marks. All right, I said. My stomach churned when I thought about the bright purple stain on the carpet in his house. After hearing Mum's news about her job, paying a carpet cleaning bill was going to be impossible. Mason, I said nervously, did your parents find out what happened? Mason nodded. Don't worry about it. It's fine. I told them it was me who spilt the drink. Relief washed through my body. I was about to thank him when our form tutor, Miss Canning, ran into the classroom. 7A, I'm afraid there has been a plain change of plan for today's visit. Marika Loft isn't able to stay for the whole day after all, so you must go to your normal lessons as usual. There was a groan from the class. All that clearing up we had to do, and she's only going to be here for 5 minutes, said Mason quietly. Marika's personal assistant had stated that she doesn't do assemblies or go on tours of school corridors, said Miss Canning, rolling her eyes. But she will spend some time with an art class, and I believe, 7A, that your form is due to have art this morning. Am I right? A few people mumbled yes, and she took the register and went through the rules about us all being on our best behaviour. When we got to the art room, Mrs. Frampton was busy rearranging easels and piles of drawing paper. Sit down, 7A, she cried. Quickly now, she's going to be here any minute. I sat between Mason and Isla and we watched as Mrs. Frampton paced around, not really knowing what to do with herself. She got to the front of the class and stopped, placing her hand on her heart. Children, you've been given an incredible opportunity here. This is a once-in-a-lifetime experience and I want you to embrace it. Today will stay with you for the rest of your lives. Crikey, talk about a build-up, whispered Mason under his breath. In front of us we had a small square canvas and a little wooden box filled with tubes of paint, 3 brushes and a pencil and a small plastic dish and a bottle of water. Mrs. Loft has very kindly donated some art materials to the school, said Mrs. Frampton. Be very careful with them. We want Marika to see what well-behaved students you are and how carefully the school will make use of any financial investment she might be willing to make to the art department. She turned and straightened one of her own paintings which appeared on the wall behind her desk. Isla, who was sitting the other side of me, leant forward and peered into her box. She took out a small tube of black paint which was branded with the famous Loft logo. "Blimey, this stuff must be well expensive," said Mason, picking out a brush which also had the Loft logo along the edge. Not only did Marika have a range of art materials, but she also had her own perfume, aftershave and handbags, apparently. "Miss," said Riley Campbell, "do you think she should donate something better if we ask nicely?" "Yeah," chimed in Pia Bowman. "Art's well boring." "I'd rather have one of her Porsches," yelled Spencer Walker. Everyone started chattering amongst themselves, and then the classroom was filled with the clatter of the boxes being tipped out onto the desks. "Keep your paints in their box," shouted Mrs. Frampton above the rabble. A few paintbrushes went flying across the room, and Mrs. Frampton darted around, rescuing them from the floor. "Stop throwing the equipment around, 7A, she screeched, crawling under a desk. "Whatever has got into you? Marika will be any second, and she won't like any of this." Bang! I'm going to leave it there, and we'll see what happens when Marika comes in tomorrow. Have a nice rest of your afternoon. I'm going to go and have my lunch now, so see you later.